As ever to the papers, one image dominates, as you've seen from the news. Abedi, the bomber, just moments before he set the bomb off. There's the Observer with a story saying that we need the EU to help us combat terror. Terrorism experts have told the Prime Minister. There's the Sun, minutes from mass murder, the same picture. And again, the Sunday Mirror, moments before massacre. The Sunday Telegraph has a very small version of the picture there. The royal presence at the Manchester commemorations. Their story is about a minister attacking the social media for being duplicitous in failing to halt terror attacks. We're going to hear a lot more about that, I suspect, in the programme to come. And there finally is the Sunday Times. Nervous Tories to relaunch May's campaign, they say. Of all the opinion polls out today, it's the Sunday Times one that shows the gap closest. And they're making a lot of that. Then again, the picture of Abedi and many other stories. So an awful lot to talk about. Craig Oliver, I guess it's a morning of contrast in terms of the newspapers when it comes to the terror attack.
Yeah, and I think that contrast is summed up by these two photographs here, one of which is Salman Abedi, a sociopath, just minutes before committing mass murder. And trying to work out what on earth was going through his head at that time. He looks incredibly calm, and it's an extraordinary image. But actually, the reality, I think, the most interesting thing is to look at some of the more human aspects of this. And I think the papers do this very well. The Sunday Mirror has got an article about Charlotte Brownhill, who was a nurse in A&E. And she talks about scans showed nuts and bolts inside bodies. It's something I'll never forget. And I thought the most touching thing was at the end when she says, "When I got home, I cried because the reality was only just sinking in. My only way of coping is to think of the goodness we saw that night and in the days since." And I think in all the politicking around the security, remembering these people and the price they paid is still really important.
It's also interesting to remember that, of course, it's become slightly fashionable to sort of have a go at NHS managers, but that happens, that sort of care, because of the dedication of NHS staff and because, frankly, it is prepared for, and there are trials and tests and practices, and that's why the NHS was and other emergency services were able to step up in the way in which they did on Monday night, really impressively.
And, of course, when you were Home Secretary, one of the things you would be doing when it comes to these kind of events is trying to track where the bombers have come from. And you have got a story, I think, in the Sunday Telegraph.
There's some really interesting analysis, actually, in the papers today about the international links to the current terror threat. And actually the sort of history of Abedi and his family and their links to Libya and the Libyan Islamic fighting group, etc. This is a challenge for terrorism because this threat changes over time. 10 years ago, we were talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, the border, the threat from Al-Qaeda. Actually, there was a lot of focus on the threat from jihadists travelling backwards and forwards to Syria. And here we see a threat that actually appears to have been at least prompted by links to Libya.
And, of course, it has to be said that Libya collapsed as a state on David Cameron's watch. It was our intervention there that knocked out the Gaddafi regime and unfortunately left a failed state, which Abedi has.
Well, you see the reality of the complication of this, and when you look at the Middle East, the tendency is to want to look and see that there's goodies and baddies, and the reality is it's a very, very complex situation and an extremely difficult one. And you're right, this week has shown that.
John Soper, let's turn to you. A lot of social media coverage of this, of course, as well.
Yes, of course, and I think that this is one of the areas where you feel that the technology of social media is so far ahead of any policy that knows quite how to deal with it. And so you've got the security minister, as you were saying in the introduction, Ben Wallace, talking about the duplicity, completely duplicitous social media companies for flogging users' personal information to questionable companies, but refusing to help terror investigations. And you're seeing it all over the world, where you've got law enforcement agencies who would love to get hold of some of the data that these companies have got. You're selling a product if you are one of the big technology companies and you want to encrypt it so that your customers' material can't be stolen, and that is a major bar to investigation.
But this is all about who in the modern world is most powerful. Are they the people running WhatsApp or national governments? And it's no longer clear who's really got the whip hand.
It's very far from clear. But, you know, and people obviously, understandably, in normal times, talk about their privacy and the right to privacy and guarding their own data. And when you get something like this, and it happened after the San Bernardino attack in California, where they found a phone, but they couldn't break into it, that people suddenly say, it's a matter of national security that we can.
I think at this point we haven't even mentioned the words general election, but we are in the middle of a general election campaign. Theresa May's got an interview in The Sun, I think, and not surprisingly, which she's taken. Sorry, we haven't got it there.
She's written, she's written an article in The Sun, which is understandably about the security issues today. But I think that if you read most of the newspapers today, what you see is coverage of how is the campaign going for each party. And there's a huge amount of stuff in here about the wobble in the Conservative Party over the last week. And Tim Shipman's done a piece in the Sunday Times where he quotes an MP saying, "It's a major cock-up. Corbyn can't win this, but we could lose it. And we've been given a bloody good go at that. All the manifesto offered was blood, sweat and tears."
There is a real feeling that just before the Manchester massacre, there was a big wobble, the U-turn over social care, and a real sense that the campaign was not going as planned.
And if you run your campaign on the basis of your leader being strong and stable, and you are arguing that actually we need to re-elect this person to handle the very difficult Brexit negotiations, and then you have a monster mess-up, essentially, in your manifesto and your plans, that is going to cause, rightly, is going to cause a wobble, and people are going to wonder about what it is they're being asked to vote for.
And the message from the Conservatives now is we want to focus again on leadership, and if there's one word that we want to keep repeating, it's Corbyn, Corbyn, Corbyn. And you pick that up from the Mail interview with Amber Rudd, who's coming on the programme.
Yes, and Simon Walters, their excellent political editor, has done an interview with her in which he says, you know, are you suggesting it would mean a greater risk of another terrorist atrocity if Corbyn became Prime Minister? Ms Rudd stressed she was not linking it to the Manchester bomb, but added, it absolutely does. Yes, and I think that you're seeing kind of, and Theresa May at her news conference that I went to at the G7 Friday evening, she also was trying to make absolutely clear the link between, you know, national security, safe with me, at risk if you elect Jeremy Corbyn as well.
And of course, Jeremy Corbyn does have some problems in his record, looking back, to say the least, his connections with the IRA and all the rest of it in the past. But it's very, very difficult in the middle of an election campaign to accuse somebody else of supporting terrorism after something like Manchester. This question of good taste and what's appropriate and reasonable to say is very, very hard for politicians to get right.
Which is why I mean, I agree with you that, you know, the terror attack was terrible. The juxtaposition with the general election campaign, which almost seems sort of naff to talk about, but actually it is casting a shadow. And in one way, you need the general election campaign actually to get back on track, because it's that democratic process, which of course the terror attack was partly against. But it's also difficult to judge rightly. And this seems to me to be a misjudgment to start talking about how many people are going to get killed under different
I think, to be fair to the Home Secretary, what's actually happened here, she's been asked a question and she's made the mistake in politics of actually answering it. And actually what we need to do is get this onto who's best to look after security. But having said all this stuff about the wobbles and the difficulty of the Conservative campaign this week, I think that The Sun actually gives a good dash of cold water to the face and just reminds people of what's really happening here. And if you look at this graphic in The Sun, Tories 46%, Labour 32%, on the issue of the economy, May 43%, Corbyn 24%, on security, May 41%, Corbyn 17%. So let's not get carried away here.
2 weeks ago, Craig.
Yeah, well, political historians, I think, would say in most election campaigns what happens is ups, there's downs, there's spills, there's thrills, and at the end of them you get more or less the result that you expected right at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's the lesson of most campaigns. But there is other bits of collateral damage that can happen during the campaign as well. And I was kind of struck by an Observer kind of research that says that favourability ratings for Theresa May, suggesting that more than a third of voters say their opinion of the Prime Minister is more negative than at the start of the campaign. 25% say it's more positive. And for Jeremy Corbyn, the reverse. And actually, as the campaign has gone on, he seems to have grown in popularity.
He's a real campaigner. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Craig Oliver, everybody is losing it a bit. They're exhausted, they're tired, they're snapping. It happens in every election campaign. You've both been involved in the atmosphere inside. We now see that the Prime Minister's special advisors are allegedly feuding. Lots of people are leaking from campaign headquarters. Run by Linton Crosby.
Yeah, I mean, I think having worked with Linton in the past, the thing that he was absolutely right on was that he does not want a running commentary on the campaign in the press. And I think, unfortunately, what you're seeing today is it's not gone brilliantly, because there is quite a lot of running commentary on the campaign. And the thing is, if you're behind the scenes, if you're an aide or an advisor, You don't want to become the story. And what you can see is that a lot of the media are actually moving a lot of behind-the-scenes people to front and centre and asking questions about that. And I think that that is something that in any campaign you want to be very careful about. Actually, there are not many stories in the papers today of any campaign saying this is something positive we will do.
If you have as big a wobble as happened last Monday with that social care promise, it's very difficult to keep things together. And it seems quite clear that people are sort of staking out their position. I never supported it anyway. I'm going to brief that. That's in one way understandable, but incredibly unhelpful for a campaign that's supposed to be strong and stable.
Destructive, yeah.
All right, well, let's move to politics elsewhere. John, you've been following Trump tours, as we've been calling them. We've all enjoyed that picture of him moving the guy aside in Montenegro, that real alpha male moment.
The Montenegro manoeuvre, the best bit of it was not just the manoeuvre, but when he did it, he went with his jacket afterwards, as if to say, job done. I'm at the front of the line now.
We definitely need a bit more machismo in international politics.
So he's now arrived back in Washington. And he's had a holiday away from all the headlines that are crowding in.
Well, I was going to ask about that, because I guess the sort of liberal fantasy from the moment he was elected is that he's going to be impeached. He won't last long. And it's just beginning to look a little bit less like a fantasy.
Yes, and I think there are problems mounting up. I mean, there's the story that's, I mean, this is from the New York Times. Trump returns to crisis over Kushner as White House tries to contain the issue. It's a very similar story in the Wall Street Journal. Jared Kushner considered setting up secret communications with Russia and this sort of supposed back channel. So everybody is lawyering up at the White House. The other big thing is this, the leak of the conversation that Donald Trump had with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, where he called Comey a nut job. That was kind of got a lot of the headlines. The really important bit was when he said, you know what, I had a lot of pressure on me, but now that I've got rid of my FBI director, that has gone. That leads to, are you obstructing justice? And that could lead to
impeachment. And we say this is not a rumour. This is probably a leaked minute.
Yes, it's not just a conversation that someone has recounted to the New York Times. It seems that that was the official minute of the meeting, saying that the president thought he was a nut job and that the pressure had been relieved and that by getting rid of him, things had got easier. If that's the case, you've got a special counsel now investigating the Russia links. It may be that there is no original Russia link, but the attempts to kind of cover things up and maybe fire the FBI director because of the job he was doing on Russia.
It's always the cover-up that gets
always the cover-up.
One of the great cliches.
Yeah.
And, of course, this does connect, sorry, I was going to say, this does connect to our election campaign and the terrible events here, doesn't it, Jackie Smith, because of all the leaks coming from outside, from the US. Which have...
I'm interested in whether or not, when he gets back to Washington, he's going to do anything about the leak of the information related to the investigation in Manchester, which looked pretty outrageous to me. And obviously the Greater Manchester Police were pretty angry about it.
I'll tell you what was fascinating. It happened when we were in Brussels on the kind of leg of the world tour. The White House staff came up to me and said, why are you making such a big... Why are the Brits making such a big fuss about this? And the journalists were... There's a very different culture in the US about revealing information. It seemed pretty commonplace what appeared in the New York Times.
Fascinating. I could sit here and talk about this all day, but sadly we've run out of time. Thank you all of you very much indeed.